Hello, my name is Craig Biddle, and I want to welcome you to the second episode of my series, Facts, Values, and Flourishing. In our first episode last week, we saw that there's a contradiction between the goal that many of us have to make our lives the very best lives they can be, to pursue the maximal happiness, in a word, to flourish, and traditional morality, the idea that being moral consists in living for others or selflessly serving others, the idea of altruism. And we saw that this contradiction is at play in multiple ways. So it has psychological consequences. If we think that we should be serving other people and sacrificing for others, yet we're off trying to make our lives the best that they can be and putting 100% of our time into that, then we're going to feel guilty for not being moral when we're just going off and doing our own thing. If that guilt pressures us into giving up on the goal of trying to make the most of our lives and sacrificing to some extent for others, then in addition to psychological consequences, we actually have existential consequences. So the way that we live, the extent of our achievement, and the kind of lives that we build will be directly affected. So and we also looked at this on the social level and even at some political consequences. And what we saw is that there are real consequences to this contradiction. And we set ourselves the mission of trying to determine whether we can find a morality that actually integrates with the goal of making our life the best it can be, and actually supports and undergirds that goal rather than contradicting it, undermining it, and retarding it. And so that's the goal for the rest of the series, is to see whether we can determine a morality that actually integrates with this idea, and then we'll unfold, if we do that, we'll unfold the various elements of that morality and see how they work together with self-help ideas and principles of good living in general. Now, we need this moral code that we're looking for to be fact-based. We need it to be demonstrably true, because if it's not, we're not going to buy into it, right? We can't just fabricate something out of the blue that happens to integrate with making our lives the best it can be and say, there, we're done. We have to make it fact-based and objective and demonstrably true. Otherwise, we're not going to buy into it, and we'll still feel like, well, we should be sacrificing, but we've just rationalized this new morality that we're going to use to try to support this goal of making our lives the best they can be. And that won't work. We can't fool ourselves that way. So we need for this moral code to actually be objectively true. And so at the start here, there's a bit of a difficulty, because the entire history of moral philosophy is an effort to try to derive moral principles from the facts of reality. Dating all the way back to ancient Greece, the sophists held that you can't derive moral principles from the facts of reality, that morality is subjective. As Protagoras put it, man is the measure of all things, by which he meant that if a person wants something, then that's a value to him, and that's how you determine values. It's just whatever you want. Everyone has his or her own values, and whatever they are, they are. This same idea was codified in the terms of is and ought by the Enlightenment thinker David Hume, who held that you cannot derive moral principles from the facts of reality. And he put it in terms of you can't derive an ought, a moral principle, from what is, from the facts. So hence we get this is-ought dichotomy. It's also called the fact-value dichotomy. It's essentially the same thing. The idea simply is you cannot derive values from facts. These are two different realms, and the twain shall never meet. So after Hume came David Hume came Immanuel Kant, who held essentially the same idea. Kant said, Hume's exactly right. You cannot derive moral principles from the facts of reality, at least not this reality. And then Kant posited another reality, which he called the noumenal world. And he said that he had access to that reality and that he could derive moral principles from that reality. And if this sounds a little bit like Christianity, it's because Hume was a Christian. Kant was a Christian, and he was essentially creating a secularized version of Christianity, or tried to. But the point remained that you can't derive moral principles from this reality, the one in which we live, the one we experience in the here and now. Fast forward to today, and this same idea is at play in various conversations with people, the intellectuals in the so-called dark web, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and various other thinkers are trying to grapple with this idea of facts and values, and can you derive moral principles from facts? One of the thinkers who has gone at Sam Harris to some extent on this, a guy named Sean Carroll, puts it this way. He says, if someone claims to have derived values from facts, it's just as if he had claimed to have added up odd numbers and arrived at an even number. And he says, you don't have to check their math if they make that claim. You know they've erred, right? So this is the idea, still fresh and alive to this day, that values cannot be derived from facts. Well, what do we get when we have this idea? We have this notion that morality is not fact-based, so what is it going to be based on? Well, this is where religion comes in to fill the void. And you've probably heard it a million times. If there is no God, anything goes. Or if there's no divine lawmaker, all things are permissible. Or however, there's several ways that people put this. Dennis Prager holds this view. He writes approximately an article a month claiming that if there is no God, anything goes. Ben Shapiro embraces this idea that if there's no divine lawmaker, then there are no moral laws. And even Jordan Peterson claims this. He says that facts and values are in two different spheres, and values can be derived only from religion and from various metaphors associated with religious tradition, and therefore you cannot derive values from facts. And in fact, Peterson goes so far as to tell atheists who claim to be, or people who claim to be atheists, such as Sam Harris, that we're not really atheists, because if we act morally, the only place we could be getting those morals from is religion. So the idea is that we're sort of piggybacking on religion, and therefore claims to atheism are actually disingenuous. So what we have here with this so-called is-ought dichotomy is a real fix, because we need moral guidance. We need to know what is the right way to act. We need to know that for our own decisions in life. How should we act? How should we act with regard to our careers, with regard to other people? How should we act sexually? How should we live our lives? What kinds of choices should we make? And we need that knowledge also for dealing with other people. If somebody treats us in a way that we regard as unjust or unfair, we need to be able to think clearly about that. What does unfair even mean? What is injustice? What is justice? Is honesty really a virtue? Why? And does that mean you can never tell a lie? What does honesty even mean? How about integrity? And so on. We need these ideas. We need them to live our own lives so that we can know that we're making choices that are good. And we need them so that we can evaluate the choices of others. And if we don't have moral principles, if we're just without them, then we are just going on the premise of utter subjectivism. Well, what does that mean? Well, unfortunately, we have lots of instances where we can draw from history to see what that means. I mean, first of all, in our own lives, if we're moving without a rudder or a moral compass of any sort, we probably run into all sorts of problems. You start lying to people, and that causes you problems, or you maybe act unjustly towards someone, and that causes you problems. And these things catch up with you. Well, if you don't know what's right and wrong, you have no way of making decisions properly in advance of the consequences of these kinds of things. If we look out at other people, we can see the problems as well. If you recall the murderers who perpetrated the Columbine massacre back in the 90s, one of them was named Eric Harris, and Eric Harris said that his philosophy was, in his terms, I am the law. If I don't like what you do, or if I don't like what you want me to do, you die. That was his philosophy. That was his morality. And if morality is just a matter of subjective whims, if it's just personal preference, then his moral code is as good as anyone else's. Some subjectivists say, well, it's not personal preference; it's social consensus. So this was the idea that the Nazis had, and the communists. The idea is that if the culture agrees, society agrees that the Jews should be slaughtered, then the Jews should be slaughtered. If society agrees that the workers have the right logic and that their desires to overthrow the capitalists and destroy them, if that's moral according to the group, then that's the way to go. As the recently deceased philosopher Richard Rorty put it, if morals cannot be derived from reality, which he believed was the case, then there's nothing we can say to the secret police when they come to drag people away in the middle of the night. There's nothing we can say to them in terms of this is factually morally wrong, because morals and facts are in two different spheres. Stanley Fish, another famous philosopher, holds that there is no such thing as morality. There's just might makes right. And this idea dates back to the Sophists as well. The idea that there's no such thing as moral right and wrong. There's just who can lord it over the other, who has the most power, and that's how we determine what is right and wrong. And this is a real catastrophe if we cannot derive moral principles from the facts of reality, because it leaves open the gate for religionists to come along and say, aha, see, you can't get morality from reality. The only way you can get morality is through revelation and faith. Observation and logic don't work, revelation and faith do, and therefore we will tell you what is moral, right? And so then the people who claim to speak for God because they have the revelations and they have the right faith and they figured out which is the right God, they're going to make decisions about what's right and wrong, and they're going to implement those decisions in our world. This is what happened when the jihadists on 9/11 flew passenger jets into skyscrapers full of people and murdered 3,000 people. Why did they do that? Because they hold that morality comes from revelation and faith, and they have faith in a God who says that they should murder infidels, and that's what they did. So we're stuck with this subjectivism versus religion, this anything goes, or there's a God who gives us divine commandments and we have to follow those. And of course, if we go that way, then you have all these religions vying for that power, and they all disagree about who should do what and who should be killed by whom, and whose God is right and whose God is wrong. It's just a mess. So this has been going on, this fact-value dichotomy, this is-ought dichotomy, and the consequences of it have been with us since the beginning of philosophic thinking. And it's with us still to this day. So the question is, can we derive moral principles from the facts of reality? Well, into this situation stepped Sam Harris a couple of years ago with his book, The Moral Landscape. And what Harris claims to have done in that book is he claims to have derived morality from reality, claims to have derived a scientific morality. But here's what he actually did. Harris, through various forms of argument, arrived at the conclusion that the standard of moral value is the well-being of conscious creatures, of all conscious creatures. Well, this is problematic on multiple fronts. First of all, it's a form of utilitarianism. So it's the idea, utilitarianism is the idea that the standard of value is the greatest good for the greatest number. And let's just focus on utilitarianism for a second, and we'll go back to Harris. So what's wrong with the idea that the standard of value is the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, where did this concept of good come from? That's exactly the thing that we're trying to prove when we're trying to determine a standard of value. We can't use the concept of good in the standard that we're trying to claim is the standard of the good, right? It's called circular reasoning. It's begging the question. And this is the problem with all forms of utilitarianism, is that they use this idea of good. I mean, it's one of the problems. There are several problems. But this is one of the big problems, is that they're using this concept of good as part of the standard of value, but that's the very thing that we're wanting to say. What does it mean, the greatest good for the greatest number? Does it mean that the greatest number of heads cut off? Does it mean the greatest number of pots of porridge? What is the good? The good is going undefined. And that's precisely the thing that we need to define. What is the good? What is value? What is, how do you derive these things from reality? You can't just dive in with that. So Harris makes an effort to say that because conscious creatures can suffer, that we can imagine that all conscious creatures suffering to the very max would be the worst, and all conscious creatures prospering to the max would be the best. And that's how he comes up with this idea that, well, that's obviously bad and this is obviously good, therefore we can arrive at this standard of value that the well-being of conscious creatures as such is the standard. But where do you get this concept of well-being? Well-being is just the same thing as what is good for conscious creatures. Well-being is a normative term. You can't just seize that and throw it in there and say we're done. This is just one of the problems with Harris's claim. The other is, even if you were to embrace this idea that the standard value is the well-being of all conscious creatures, how are you going to implement that? How are you supposed to implement, how are you going to come up with principles that guide you to act in such a way that you can benefit the well-being of the greatest number of conscious creatures? So utilitarianism already has the problem of trying to include all human beings in your hedonistic calculus, as it's called, to try to figure out how you're supposed to act. Harris expands the problem by adding all conscious creatures to it. And now we're going to have to figure out a set of moral principles to ensure that all of our actions are advancing the well-being of all conscious creatures. I mean, this is just impossible. So A, it's circular reasoning or question begging to even use well-being as the standard. And B, it's an impossible system. It doesn't work. It can't work. There's no way to use it. It's impracticable. So here we are with this idea that you cannot derive values from facts. We have probably the most visible instance of someone trying to do that today is Sam Harris, and his effort fails. And then you have Jordan Peterson steps back in and reminds Harris and everyone else that, see, you can't get values from facts. These are two completely different spheres. Values are over here, facts are over here, and the only way that we can understand values is through religion, mysticism, fables, etc. Right? There's no way to derive morality from reality. And this is where we are. So, can we do this? The philosopher Ayn Rand says we can and shows that we can. And I want to talk now about how Ayn Rand bridged the so-called is-ought gap, how she derived moral principles from observation and logic, how she did it without any question begging, and how it helps us understand morality and a type of morality that is actually conducive to human flourishing and that is practicable. It's a code of values that we can get our heads around, that we can understand in terms of facts and logic, and that we can actually use to guide our lives, to evaluate ourselves and other people, to defend rights and to defend freedom. So it's really a beautiful thing, and let's turn to that now. So when Ayn Rand approaches morality, she doesn't do so by just looking around at the various moral codes that already exist and saying to herself, well, which one of these should I pick? She instead asks a very fundamental question. She steps back and she says, wait a minute, does man need morality at all? If so, why? Right? Because if we need morality, then the reason why we need it is going to shed some light on which morality is correct and which is not. But if we don't need morality, then we don't need it. And if we don't need it, we just set it aside and go on about our business. There's no point in worrying about it. There's no point in spending any time on this subject. So this is a really logical question to ask at the beginning of an inquiry into morality. Do we need this thing? So what is morality, she asks, and she's looking here for just a generic description of what morality is. What is it about the world that gives rise to this concept of morality? What is this thing? And she describes, or she defines morality as a code of values to guide one's choices and actions. And we can see that this is true of all codes of morality. Whether they have any bearing or whether they have any fact bearing or not is a separate question. But what all codes of morality are intended to do is to guide people's choices and actions in their lives. So this is true of Christian morality, it's true of altruism, it's true of hedonism, of utilitarianism, of egoism, of all different moralities. This is what they aim to do, is to guide people's choices and actions. So that's what morality is. And Rand is wondering, do we need this thing? Do we need a code of values to guide our choices and actions? And so she steps back again and says, well, okay, in order to figure this out, we need to be clear on this central term here, values. Morality is a code of values to guide our choices and actions. What are values and why does man need them? So she gets deeper into the issue by being more precise about the question she's asking. What are values and why does man need them? Either we need these things or we don't. If we don't need them, we don't need them. We can forget about it. If we do need values, then the reason why we need values is going to go a long way to helping us understand which values are correct and which are not. So you see the method here is very scientific. So Rand looks out at reality and she wants to figure out what values are and whether we need them. Now, she's not just going to go and grab what other people have said values are, because that's just going to perpetuate the problem. Other people's conceptions of values have essentially been problematic, right? So instead of doing that, she asks herself, well, when we use the concept of value, what are we trying to capture with it? What facts of reality are we trying to gather in this concept? She looks out at the world and she says, okay, well, when we say somebody values something, what does that mean? Well, people go after money. They act to gain and keep money, right? They value money. That's sort of what that idea means right there. We see it from another angle. Students act to gain and keep high grades. A's. Students go after A's. They act to gain and keep their grades there. So they value their grades. Churchgoers go to church and they act in a way to gain and keep a special relationship with God, right? They value this relationship with God. So churchgoers act to gain and keep this relationship because they value it. We can see this with the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers founded this country, a land of freedom. Why? Because they value freedom. They took all these actions to establish the United States because they value freedom. And by these kinds of examples, Rand was able to draw the conclusion that a value is that which one acts to gain or keep, right? And again, this is a generic description or definition of value. We can see that it's true. This is what we mean by value. People value money, they value good grades, they value a relationship with God, they value freedom. The things that people act to gain and keep are their values. Now, Rand wants to know, why do we pursue values? What is this all about? But she wants to be scientific about this, so she's going to step back again. And one of the things she notes that not only human beings pursue values, but other animals pursue values too. And not only other animals, but plants pursue values as well. So if we look out at the world, we can see a tiger pursues values. A tiger chases down a wild boar. A tiger seeks shade under a tree. It values the boar. It values the shade. The same is true of a rabbit. A rabbit nibbles on vegetation. It values vegetation. It burrows down into the ground. It values shelter. The same is true of snakes and mice. A snake goes after a mouse. It values the mouse. The mouse tries to get away. It values remaining free from the snake. And we can see this with human beings. So we can see it all across the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. What does a tree do? A tree shoots its roots down into the ground. Why? Because it values water and minerals. It turns its leaves toward the sky. Why? Because it values sunlight, right? So the values values are things that are objects that an organism acts to gain or keep. A value is that which one acts to gain or keep. And this we can see by the perceptual level observation method and by observing that this is what we actually mean. This is the reason that we have this concept, is to capture these kinds of instances. That's what value means. Rand further notes that only living things pursue values, right? So if we look out at the world, we see rocks and rivers and hammers and other non-living things. They're not pursuing values. They're not acting to gain and keep things. They don't take self-generated, goal-directed action in the same way that living things do, right? A rock just sits wherever it is until some outside force, such as a wave or a hammer, hits and moves it. The same is true of a river. A river, this body of water, it's moving, but it's not generating its own action. There's an outside force, namely the gravitational pull of the earth, that is making the water move. A hammer doesn't drive nails all by itself, right? It only drives nails if a living thing picks it up and hammers the nails. So Rand observes that living things pursue values, and only living things pursue values. She further observes that the concept of value, the very idea of value, presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. And we can see this, right? So if a tiger is chasing a wild boar, the wild boar is of value to whom? To the tiger, right? That's pretty clear. Pretty clear. The answer to whom is pretty clear. But the answer to for what is not exactly obvious, so we'll broaden this a bit. The rabbit is nibbling on vegetation and burrowing into the ground. So it values vegetation and it values shelter. That's a value to the rabbit. What are these values for? That's still an open question. The snake goes after the mouse. The mouse tries to run away. Both of them are acting toward values, right? And one of them is valuing the other one, and the other one is valuing getting away or valuing its freedom. Human beings act to gain and keep these things. So the values that we act to gain are values to us, and the question for what remains. So we have this question. Well, Rand observes that another thing that values presuppose is an entity capable of acting to achieve a goal in the face of an alternative. If you think about it, this is true. There are alternatives in all of these cases. What happens if the tiger doesn't catch the boar? What happens if the rabbit doesn't find vegetation or doesn't make it to shelter? What happens if the snake catches the mouse, or what happens if it doesn't catch the mouse? What ultimately is at stake? And this is where Rand developed just the most seminal aspect of her entire moral theory. And I want to read a passage from Rand, from her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. And this is where we see where Rand really put her finger on what's going on here. So you see, we've just been looking scientifically at the world. We see that we see that people are acting for values. We see that other animals are acting for values. Even plants are acting for values. And we see that non-living things are not acting for values. And we see that the things that do act toward values, well, the values are a value to that thing. And now we're trying to figure out, what are the values for? What difference does it make whether a living organism obtains a value or not? And toward answering that, Rand writes this: there is only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it pertains to a single class of entities, to living organisms. The existence of inanimate matter is unconditional. The existence of life is not. It depends on a specific course of action. Matter is indestructible. It changes forms, but it cannot cease to exist. It is only a living organism that faces a constant alternative, the issue of life or death. Life is a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. If an organism fails in that action, it dies. Its chemical elements remain, but its life goes out of existence. It is only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible. Now, this is amazing. This is a really profound identification. All of this is scientific. This is just observing reality and what values are and why we need them. And what Rand has discovered is that values are things that living organisms pursue, that the value is a value to the organism in pursuit of that value, and that the reason why the living organism is pursuing the value is in order to live. Values are for life. Life is what gives rise to the possibility of values and to the need of values. And this, I want to drive this home from several angles here, because this is really important. It is only life that makes values possible, right? Only living things can pursue values. The rock doesn't pursue any values. The hammer doesn't pursue any values. And only living things need to pursue values. Why? Because in order to remain alive, they have to achieve certain values. A rock just remains a rock no matter what. You can smash it, you can change its form, you can melt it, you can turn it into lava, you can do all sorts of things to change its form, but you can't make the physical matter go out of existence. Likewise for a hammer. You can change the form of the hammer, but you can't get rid of the stuff. You can't get rid of the physical stuff. The only thing that can go out of existence is life. Only living organisms face this alternative of life or death. And values are precisely the things that living organisms pursue in order to sustain their lives. So only life makes values possible, and only life makes values necessary. In order to pursue values, a thing has to be alive. And in order to stay alive, the thing has to pursue values and actually has to achieve them. It's possible for a living organism to pursue values and not achieve them, right? The tiger might not catch food. He might starve to death. The rabbit might not make it to shelter. It might get eaten, and so on. Human beings, we might achieve our values that we pursue, or we might not. If we don't, if we're unable to pursue our values, or if we're unable to achieve the values that are necessary for our lives, we perish. So what Ayn Rand has done is she's identified the alternative of life or death as the fundamental alternative that gives rise to the entire issue of values. Only living things need values. Only living things can pursue values. Living things have to pursue values in order to stay alive. And this brings us to what the upshot of all of this is. Rand has put her finger on what is the ultimate value for all living things, and that is the living thing's life. Life for any given organism is the standard of value. the standard of value for that kind of thing. Now, each animal has its own requirements for life, but for each animal and for each plant, for each living organism, that organism's life, based on what that organism is its standard of value. The requirements of its life constitute the standard of value. Now, with human beings, of course, we have free will, and this adds a layer of complexity. Free will, the ability to choose our values, to choose our actions, this is what gives rise to the field of morality. Human beings have moral values, right? Animals and plants don't, there's no moral code for tigers. There's no moral code for trees. Animals and plants either vegetatively pursue their values or automatically, in instinctual terms, pursue their values. They just automatically go after what they are programmed by nature, by evolution, to go after. Human beings have free will, so we can choose to pursue our life-serving values, or we can choose to pursue life-harming values. People can poison themselves with alcohol and drugs till they're just toast. People can sit around and do nothing all day. Even though that's not going to advance their life, they can do it, right? So people can even commit suicide. We have the capacity, and some people do it, to pick up a gun or take a pill and kill ourselves. So human beings, because we have free will, are able to take anti-life actions. Indeed, we can even embrace a whole moral code that says we should take anti-life actions. The morality of altruism says exactly that. It says that to be moral, you should sacrifice your values instead of pursue your values. You should give up your values and live for others. Give up the things that would make your life great. Sacrifice for other people. Or in case of environmentalism, sacrifice for snails and rocks or whatever. So we can not only act against our values, against our life, we can have whole codes of morality or whole systems of thought aimed at helping us to do that, to act against our life. But here's the thing. Nothing in the universe, nothing in the fabric of reality necessitates anti-life action. There's no reason to take anti-life action. Human beings can act against their life, but they don't need to. There's nothing to be gained from acting against one's life. So even though we have free will, that doesn't change anything about the objective standard of morality. The only reason we can pursue values is because we're alive, and the only reason we need to pursue values is in order to remain alive. If you don't want to remain alive, you can just stop acting altogether, and in short order you'll suffer and you'll die. So in order to stay alive, we have to pursue values. And this is what morality is all about. It's about a code of values and principles to guide our thought and action so that we can live. And this is Rand's discovery of two things. There are two levels here. So there's life is the standard of value, and that's true for all living things. And then there's human life, or man's life, is the standard of moral value. So the requirements of human life, and by requirements of human life, she means the full context of what's necessary for a human being. We're not gnats, and we don't live for a moment or a day, right? We live for years and decades. And we're not just physical beings. We're physical and spiritual beings. We have body and we have mind. We have matter and we have spirit. We have psychologies. We have emotional faculties. We're an integrated being of body and mind, matter and spirit. So that being's life is what we're talking about when we say the requirements of human life constitute the standard of moral value. So there's more complexity here. It's not, we're not just trees or tigers. Our lives are much more complex. But the standard of value remains our life, the life of the kind of animal that we are. So as we can see, this is a scientific approach to arriving at a standard of moral value, and it makes sense. It's derived from observation and logic. We can see the steps. There are more steps to it, but you see the general idea here. And what Rand demonstrated is that the very idea of values only arises in relation to life. life is what makes values possible, and life is what makes values necessary. And it's the only thing that makes values possible and necessary. So human life is the standard of moral value. It's the objective standard of moral value in Rand's view. Now we're going to talk a lot more about what this means. So what we've covered here today is what's technically called the meta-ethics. So it's the portion of ethics where you're trying to figure out what is the standard of value, and what do these terms value and good and should and the like mean. And that area is called meta-ethics. Normative ethics is the portion of ethics where once you have a conception of the standard of the good, the standard of value, then you have principles and values and virtues regarding how people should act. So what should we do and what should we not do? Those would be the virtues versus the vices. And that's what we'll be talking about moving forward. And what we're going to see is that all of this is anchored in this observation-based, scientific, logically grounded derivation of life as the standard of value. What we'll do next week is I was initially thought that I would present Ayn Rand's theory of how she arrived, or how she bridged the Azot gap and arrived at an objective basis for morality. I thought I would do that in plus go over some objections to Rand's views all in one day. That is just too much. It would overload your mind and it would be too much for a video. So what I'm going to do is we'll do a whole session next week on objections to Rand's conception of life as the standard of value and her derivation of this. And we'll steelman these arguments. We'll give the best interpretation of arguments against Rand's idea, and we'll see whether her views hold water. And I think we'll see that they do. And then the following week, we'll dive into specific values that arise from this way of thinking and specific virtues. And we'll move forward from there in accordance with the handout that I hope you have printed. If you haven't printed the handout, just search Facts, Values, and Flourishing, and you'll find the PDF. So that's it for today. I want to say one quick note about Q&A. I had thought that I might do Q&A at the beginning of each session and sort of answer questions that had come in since the last one. But most of the questions that I've received since last week are questions that will be answered in the course of this series. And rather than preempting my points on those, I'd rather have them come in the flow of the discussion, because then there will be a hierarchy to the way that you understand all of this. So I'm actually going to put off questions and answers until the end of the series. And what we'll do is we'll have a whole day or a whole session, possibly even 2 sessions, devoted to answering questions about what we've heard over the 7 or 8 weeks of the series. So if you have questions, you're welcome to submit them now, or you're welcome to retain them. But I won't be answering questions until the end, and at that point I'll pull together the questions that I think are of general interest, and we'll do a whole session or 2 answering them. I hope you're finding this enlightening and enjoyable and fun to hear about. These ideas are so powerful when you start to understand what we have here, a fact-based morality, and what the implications of this are for our personal lives, for social life, for freedom, for flourishing. It's a really big deal. So if you are enjoying this, please let your friends know about this series. They can watch the episodes that they've missed. They're all online. Share this far and wide. Let people know that this is going on, and get them to tune in. And I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Until then, love your life.